In cities across America, people lost their jobs, were evicted from their homes, and ended up on the streets. They created these small shacks and moved their entire families into them. Other families did the same. Pretty soon you had a small town within the city. These were known as shanty towns. They earned the nickname Hooverville after the president. Everything bad was named after the president. The newspapers that the homeless slept under were called Hoover blankets. Men's empty pants pockets were called Hoover flags. Soup kitchens began to spring up all over cities. It was a place where you could get a free or reduced lunch. If you look at the photo, they're all male and mostly white. Bread lines also became very common. If you look at the photo, you'll notice that everyone in that line is well dressed, male, and white. Sometimes you could stand in a bread line all day just to feed your family. The Great Depression didn't hit only cities. It hit rural areas as well. But people in rural areas had one advantage over people that lived in the city. They could grow their own food. That is, as long as they could keep their land. Between 1929 and 1932, 400,000 farmers lost their farms. The lucky ones turned to tenant farming and barely scraped out a living. During the 1920s, farmers from Texas to North Dakota used tractors to break up grasslands and plant millions of acres of new farmland. Farmers had exhausted the land through overproduction of crops. The grasslands became unsuitable for farming. In the early 1930s, a drought wreaked havoc on the Great Plains. When the drought and winds began in the early 1930s, little grass and trees were left to hold the soil down. The region that was hardest hit was known as the Dust Bowl. It's the colored area in the map covering the states Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. However, the dust storms affected all of the Great Plains states, including Nebraska, South and North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. One windstorm in 1934 picked up millions of dust from the plains and carried it to the East Coast. There are records of cargo ships coming into New York with layers of dust. How would you feel if you were trying to work in the field and saw this coming? What would you do? Run inside? Then you might be trapped inside. Besides, there's no safety in your home. You would go to the cupboard to get a plate to put on the table. It would already have a layer of dust on it. There was no escaping the dust. What do you think happens to your lungs after breathing in this dusty air for a while? President Roosevelt wanted to capture the effects of the Great Depression on the average American on film. One of the best-known photojournalists in American history is Dorothea Lange, whose photos of the hardships of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression influenced the development of documentary photography and showed the human side of the effects of the Depression. Here are a couple examples of her work. John Steinbeck, one of America's most famous authors, wrote The Grapes of Wrath, a book about the lives of Oklahomans who fled the Dust Bowl for California. Okies, as they were nicknamed, were refugee farm families from the southern Great Plains who migrated to California to escape the Dust Bowl. The humiliation of not being able to support your family for 1, 2, or 3 years was too much for some men to bear. 300,000 men abandoned their families and wandered around the country looking for work, aid, or shelter. They became known as hobos. Their main mode of transportation was hitching rides on railroad boxcars. There were so many of them, they even developed their own code or secret language, called hobo code. With the men gone, it was left to women and children to come up with enough food and money to support the family. Eventually, children started to develop malnutrition diseases like rickets. Look at the girl in the picture. She's a victim of malnourishment. Older boys followed in their father's footsteps. They left their homes so their families could have one less mouth to feed. They were called Hoover tourists. Women were often too ashamed to show their hardship, especially single women that lived alone. After losing her job, a woman would lock herself in her apartment with one sleeve of crackers. She would eat one cracker a day until she was on the brink of starvation. Oftentimes, no one would know that she had died until a superintendent came to the door and found her body. As you see in the photo, single women called for businesses to fire married women to open up jobs for single women who didn't have a husband to bring in money. Minorities had it worse than whites. They used to have the jobs that no one else wanted. With unemployment rising, they now had to compete with whites for their jobs. While unemployment nationwide rose to 25%, it was twice that amount for blacks. The government got involved with the Mexican Repatriation Act, sending 1.8 million Mexican Americans to Mexico, ignoring the fact that over 80% of them were U.S. citizens. President Hoover took a cautious approach to dealing with the Depression. He did not believe that the government should give direct relief to the needy. He called it rugged individualism. What does that mean? No welfare. He gathered business, banking, and labor leaders together and asked them to find a way to create solutions to our economic woes. When that didn't work, he authorized the government to build the Boulder Dam on the Colorado River. It provided thousands of jobs and electricity to 7 states: Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. He also convinced Congress to pass the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. It lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans and avoid foreclosure. Congress also passed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It authorized up to $2 billion for emergency financing for banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and other large businesses. Hoover believed that money would trickle down to the average citizen through job growth and higher wages. Do you think big business owners use that money to create jobs and raise wages? Absolutely not. They used that money to stay in business. It proved to be too little, too late.
Probably the last nail in Hoover's presidential coffin was his response to the bonus army. After World War I, Congress passed a piece of legislation stating that every man who served in World War I would receive about $1,000 in 1945. With depression hurting so many people, the Army veterans wanted the money early to help get them through the Depression. A congressman from Texas, Wright Patman, believed that they should receive an average of $500 right now. To support him, almost 20,000 Army veterans and their families peacefully marched on Washington. They set up a Hooverville right outside the Capitol building. At first, Hoover treated them nicely, even feeding them. However, when Congress voted against the bill, Hoover then asked the bonus army to leave. All but about 2,000 people left. Worried that things would get out of hand, Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur and Dwight D. Eisenhower to disband the bonus army. It turned violent. The Hooverville was burned to the ground. The bonus army was tear-gassed. One child was killed, and many other people were injured. Hoover's image was severely hurt by the images. He never recovered and lost the election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt.